Good morning and welcome to the DCF ACNJ Regional Forum. Good morning. I'm Seal Zalkin, President of Advocates for Children of New Jersey, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the forum, regional forum, co-hosted by ACNJ and the Department of Children and Families. This is an update of a forum that we held in July, and I'm really excited to hear the updates from the Department of Children and Families on some very positive and exciting developments since that last forum. It's my pleasure this morning, before I introduce Commissioner Beyer, to provide some context for the discussion that will follow. I'm particularly excited about the presentation you'll hear today because so much of it aligns with the work that is going on in New Jersey to support the healthy growth and development of young children prenatal to age 3 and their families. ACNJ, as many of you know, chairs the Think Babies Coalition. This is a coalition that came together in 2018, supported by a grant from 0 to 3, and then strengthened by a grant from the Pritzker Children's Initiative. This is a broad coalition of many public and private partners. I know many of you are on the call today that have been meeting over the last 3 years to design an agenda to support, again, the healthy growth and development of young children. Our specific goal is to make New Jersey the safest, most equitable place to have a baby and raise a family, aligned obviously with the First Lady's Nurture and J agenda. It's just an incredible opportunity to look at this important part of a child's life. Our agenda, the Think Babies agenda, focuses on some specific objectives, which are to improve access to high quality childcare, to expand access to evidence-based home visiting, to improve the system of infant mental health services, and also to support maternal and infant health to significantly reduce Black infant mortality and maternal morbidity. And as you will hear today, New Jersey has made some amazing progress in each of these areas, not the least of which is the passage of the Universal Home Visiting Law, which Governor Murphy signed into law in June, and you'll hear about a little later in the morning. Again, what I'd like to do is just provide some context for the discussion. As part of its children's initiative, the Pritzker Foundation, and this is a national initiative that they've launched, also funded a prenatal to 3 policy impact center at the University of Texas. They asked the center to develop those key policies, strategies, and outcomes that are needed to achieve a high quality, equitable system for children prenatal to age 3 and their families. And the center started working on what do states need to have in place to support and move toward this high quality system. And then to use this roadmap to measure states' progress on achieving its goals. The center published the roadmap in September of 2020, outlining effective policies, strategies, and outcomes that states should use as a guide or a roadmap to carry out their agenda. This September, they released the first report on states' progress. And I'm here to talk a little bit about that report, focusing on the 5 effective policies that the center identified as key to this system of care for very young children. I find these interesting because they're a little different. And you'll see when we get into their findings that they really look at the basics. What's the foundation that families need to build that social service system upon? Do they have access to food, income, healthcare? And I think that provides a very basic foundation that the social service system could be built around. It's fundamental. So let me share with you the findings from this year's report and where New Jersey landed. So if I could have the first slide. Okay, we can go to the next one. Well, it was good news for New Jersey because when this was released in September, we were identified as one of only 4 states, California, the District of Columbia, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, to have adopted and implemented what the center has described as the 5 effective policies to support a prenatal to 3 system. Again, these are key policies that foster nurturing environments and promote equity. And they're based on the critical importance of the early years, prenatal to age 3, as the foundation, as fundamental to healthy growth and development and future success. So let me take you through these 5 effective strategies so you can see where New Jersey has really risen above the rest of the country. Next slide, please. First policy is that families should have access to health insurance. Their recommendation is that the state has adopted and fully implemented the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act to include coverage for adults with incomes up to 138% of the federal poverty level. In fact, New Jersey was one of the first 6 states to sign up for the early Medicaid expansion option in 2010. And this year, New Jersey took 2 important steps forward. One, expanded Medicaid coverage for women 12 months postpartum, and we became a handful of states that did that. And second, launched their Cover All Kids initiative to make sure that every child in New Jersey had access to health insurance. New Jersey's made great progress in family care and ensuring that children are covered. And this is to take that final step to make sure that the last number of children remaining without insurance have health insurance. Next slide, please. Second policy is to make sure that families have access to SNAP, the State Nutrition Program. We know how critical SNAP has been during the pandemic. And it also is a pathway to other essential food programs like the school meals and WIC. Recommendation from the center is that the state makes this a very simplified recertification and application process for all eligible families with children. And in New Jersey is one of 26 states that use a 12-month recertification and simplified reporting to all eligible families with children. Next slide, please. Third policy, effective policy, is family leave. Recommendation is the state has adopted and fully implemented a paid family leave program of a minimum of 6 weeks following the birth, adoption, or placement of a child into foster care. In fact, New Jersey has one of the oldest family leave programs in the country. We go back at least 10 years having adopted family leave. And 2 years ago, New Jersey strengthened the family leave law to extend benefits up to 12 weeks and address some of the disparities in how much an individual can receive while out on family leave. Next slide, please. State minimum wage is the 4th effective policy that the center identified. Recommendation that the state has adopted and fully implemented a minimum wage of $10 an hour or greater. In fact, in New Jersey, we're on a pathway to reach $15 an hour by 2024. Right now, the minimum wage is $12 an hour. Next slide. And the last effective policy involves our state earned income tax credit, with the recommendation that the state has adopted and fully implemented a refundable earned income tax credit of at least 10% of the federal EITC for all eligible families with children under the age of 3. In fact, New Jersey adopted a state earned income tax credit many years ago, and now our refundable credit is up to 40% of the federal EITC, and recent legislation extended eligibility for the EITC to workers 18 years and older, regardless of dependence. So, next slide, please. So why should all this matter, right? We're here to talk about services. You're going to hear about universal home visiting. You're going to hear about the ACEs initiative, the work that's going on in the children's system of care. To me, this is the foundation upon which all of that work is based. These are the critical policies to ensure the basic support of families with children. So those services are building on a system that meets the basic needs of families, provides that essential foundation that we can build those strategies and services on to improve outcomes. To me, this is especially relevant now because of the state and federal focus on the early years, the healthy growth and development of children prenatal to age 3 and their families. This is an initiative here in New Jersey, starting initially with the First Lady's Nurture NJ initiative, but also growing into, I think, a much greater awareness about the importance of the early years, and now a federal focus through the Build Back Better Act, which is pending in Washington now. And it's essential to the goals of supporting families effectively and preventing foster care placement, which I know is a critical goal of the Department of Children and Families. So I think if you're interested in seeing the full report, you'll have an email that you can send to ACNJ. I'd be happy to make it available to people. I think it is an interesting analysis of what states need to have in place to build this system. So before I introduce the commissioner, some logistics for today. Because of the size and how many speakers we have today, it's going to be very difficult to have an interactive Q&A, but we do want to hear from you. So I would say if you have questions, comments, please put them in the Q&A. We will get back to you, either ACNJ or DCF will get back to you to address any questions you have. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be 2 emails addresses that you can use to be in touch with ACNJ and DCF about any questions or comments. I look forward to the webinar this morning and to hearing from you in the Q&A and any follow-up. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Christine Norbert-Beyer to give you the beginning of this update today. Again, we've appreciated the partnership with DCF and found these regional forums to be a great opportunity to hear about the work that's going on in the state so that we all are on the same page and understand the exciting work ahead. So Christine, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Seal. So good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today. Before I begin my remarks, I want to also thank you, Seal, for ACNJ's ongoing and valued partnership with us at DCF, not only around these regional and virtual forums, but on a host of important initiatives, many of which you just ran through. We've been strong allies of each other's work, and I appreciate your advocacy and activism on behalf of New Jersey's children and families. I also want to take a moment to wish Mary Coogan well. We know she's at home watching and hopefully resting, Mary. We miss you today and wish you a speedy recovery. During our last virtual forum in July, we shared updates about various initiatives contained within our DCF strategic plan and the progress that's being made in those areas today. In spite of, or maybe because of, the pandemic, we've all had an opportunity to re-examine and reaffirm our priorities and to forge ahead in ways that don't just serve the men, women, children, and families who look to us for support, but in ways that truly buoy them and strengthen their capacity for resilience. I'm so incredibly proud of our DCF staff for their commitment to New Jersey's families during these extremely difficult times. I'm also grateful to all of you, our providers, partners, and stakeholders for your determination and dedication. Together, we're making notable changes in the lives of the children and families we work with, helping them through crises that might otherwise put them at risk for child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, sexual assault, homelessness, mental illness, addiction, and hopelessness. It's vital work, and we're making great headway, which you'll hear more about from each of our presenters today. When we added the election as a topic on the agenda several weeks ago during our planning for this forum, we assumed it would be, or I assumed it would be, just a quick review of a fairly routine day. Little did we know. So this last week has certainly been a nail biter. At this point, I think we can confidently say that Governor Murphy was reelected along with Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver. But there are some pretty significant changes coming in the legislature. When we put this presentation together, it looked like the Republican Party gained a total of 12 legislative seats across both houses. Assembly Democrats lost 8 incumbent members, and the Senate may lose 4. A couple of these races are still undecided as provisional, absentee, and mail-in ballots continue to be counted. In true Trenton fashion, though, things are moving forward, even with some pending election results. Next slide. So new leadership has been announced in both houses, and the balance of power has shifted, as I said. We don't know how or if these changes will impact legislative initiatives affecting children and families in New Jersey, but I do know that our collective work to keep all New Jersey families safe, healthy, and connected continues. We'll not slow our pace or our commitment to transform child welfare in New Jersey. Our strategic goals remain in place through January, at which point we'll assess our direction, our achievements, and our challenges. Together, we'll set new goals and priorities for the next 4 years. I'm looking forward to learning more about the governor's next term and the policy focus of Governor Murphy's administration, which will be to continue many of the policies that are already in place and have been actionable. But I expect that there will be more that we'll be able to do together. So in the meantime, I look forward to our ongoing connection and collaboration. We've already achieved so much together, and I'm looking forward to continuing our work on behalf of children and families. Transformation is on the horizon, and with the dedication and ideas of the entire child and family serving system, not just DCF, we will continue to accomplish great things. So next slide. So now I'm pleased to introduce Florence Racine, DCF's new Director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Florence has nearly 30 years of experience in government and child welfare. She's been with DCF since 1996, before DCF existed, working in a host of positions, including performance management, case practice model implementation, quality improvement, IAIU, and child protection. Florence is a licensed social worker with expertise in analyzing quality of service and developing and implementing effective strategies for improvement on a state level. Her journey in race equity began over 15 years ago. She'll tell us today about the work she's doing in this new office and how it aligns with our strategic goal of promoting equitable treatment of all New Jersey constituents and equitable outcomes for DCF services. After Florence, we'll welcome Joyce James. Joyce is a consultant with DCF. She's a licensed master social worker who began her professional career as a child protective services caseworker and has established an impressive 40-year history in working to improve outcomes for children, youth, and families. For the past 24 years, she has led the charge across the country to raise issues of institutional and structural racism in all helping systems. Her journey from CPS caseworker to assistant commissioner of the Texas CPS system to leader of the Center for Elimination of Disproportionality and Disparities is a powerful one. She'll talk with us today about how equal treatment doesn't lead to equity. So thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you, Florence.
Thank you, Commissioner Beyer. Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here with you virtually today. As Commissioner Beyer talked about, I am the new director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I just wanted to introduce you to this office as a key new integral part of the Department of Children and Families core approach to this. And what we intend to carry out is to become an anti-racist system by addressing racial bias, disproportionality, and disparities and inequities. And when we think about diversity and inclusion, it's issues involving African Americans, people of color, women, gender, and specifically when we talk about gender, we're referring to those who have a gender identity or gender expression that falls outside of the gender binary male and female. When we talk about sexual orientation, it refers to those whose sexual orientations differ from heterosexual. Next slide. Next slide. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, here I've simply defined it so that just to have a shared understanding around when we refer to these terms, this is what we're talking about. Really, when we talk about diversity, we're looking to, for populations that have been and remain underrepresented and are marginalized in our broader society, for equity, about promotion of justice, impartiality, and fairness. And when we talk about inclusion, it's the degree to which diverse individuals can participate fully in decision-making processes. Inclusion outcomes are met when you and your institution and your program are truly inviting to all. And that truly is the goal of this office. Next slide. The Office of DEI will now coordinate the work of DCF's Race Equity Steering Committee and develop a program structure. We want to develop and implement initiatives that promote equitable outcomes for children and families of color. We want to build the capacity of staff at all levels at DCF to respond effectively to structural racism and individual implicit bias. When we think about that, we want to understanding that the journey starts at the personal level with individuals committed to the work. To make progress, each individual must commit to learn, reflect, and grow continually. We want to promote culturally competent policy and practice within DCF and among our contracted services. As the organization's work happens within systems, whether it's a neighborhood or community committed to like-minded practitioners, the number of committed organizations increases the opportunities for systems change, and opportunities for systems change will do the same. So as we all grow and continue to implement these practices, our system will begin to change in response to this. Next slide. Our Office of our Racial Equity Steering Committee is involved. We have several subcommittees working on different areas in order to really tackle our issues around equity. We look at our data and evaluation to understand what's happening. We are looking and reviewing all of our policies and practices to make sure that they have an equity lens. We are training all of our staff in order to integrate a racial and cultural equity into all of our trainings that we give to our staff and our providers. Communications, we proactively manage internal and external communications related to race equity issues. And when we look at our resources and contracting, including our prevention work, we really want to achieve realignment of resources to better serve families and children of color. So our next slide. Over the last 4 years, DCF has been investing in understanding disproportionality in our child welfare system and the role of structural and institutional racism. We began by collecting data to understand the scope and breadth of the issue. And then we had the creation of our Race Equity Steering Committee since 2019. Now we'll go through just a few data slides just to support the need for the equity work and the impact on our families in New Jersey. Next slide. The analysis of our 2020 key decision points, just to orient you to the graph. First, disproportionality. You may notice the growth of the teal section of the column with each decision point for Black children, and the opposite for the gray, which represents our white children. Based on New Jersey's child population, Black children are 3 times as likely to be reported as child victims to the hotline than their white peers, and almost 2 times as likely as their Hispanic peers. Black children are 4 times as likely to experience family separation compared to their white peers, and almost 2 times as likely as their Hispanic peers. Based on New Jersey child population, Hispanic children are almost 2 times as likely compared to their white peers. Next slide. Over time, CPMP has shifted away from family separation as a safety intervention. Even as the number of reports to the hotline increased from 2016 to 2019, the number of children entering out-of-home placement during that time decreased by 40%, then an additional 37% from 2019 to 2020. Over the last 4 years alone, the point-in-time foster care census has safely dropped by almost 2/3 of its 2015 volume, as you see here. It is important to note that this reduction is occurring while New Jersey maintains important gains in child safety. And New Jersey has been able to maintain this reduction in the use of foster care placement, despite being a state that has been hit hard by the opioid epidemic. Next slide. Over time, the placement rates for children of all races have decreased. However, we see that our Black children continue to be more likely to enter out-of-home placement than the Hispanic or white children. In 2013, Black children were 2.8 times as likely as Hispanic children and 4.6 times as likely as white children. In 2020, Black children continue to enter out-of-home placement at a rate of 2.6 times as likely as our Hispanic children, or almost 4 times as likely as our white children. Next slide. So in our Race Equity Steering Committee, we've been really working effortlessly and provided varied learning opportunities to examine the history of racism in child welfare, the impact of systemic racism and implicit bias, and to develop a fluency about race and racism, contracting with subject matter experts who are leaders in the field. We presented DCF data highlighting the racial disparity. We've discussed language and definitions related to race equity, including culture, disparate outcomes, equality versus equity, and implicit bias. We reviewed how DCF's policies and practices work to exacerbate or eliminate racial bias with the families we serve. Reviewing how DCF's contracts and providers inhibit or support race equity with the families we serve. And we built a linkage with our judicial disproportionality work, and we participate in the CSC conference and the Judicial Learning Exchange and are part of the Race Equity Committee with the AOC. Next slide. In March 2021, our entire workforce, which represents diverse areas such as behavioral health, child protection, gender-based violence, family and community partnerships, the business offices, adolescent services, all of our offices in DCF, to have a greater impact on, we engage our community providers and stakeholders to also participate in these trainings. And we also plan to engage our communities that have been affected so that we can have our family voices, such as parents and older youth, to ensure we capture their voices and lived experiences. Next slide. How this work looks for the Race Equity Steering Committee, we've phased out our trainings. Our phase 1, we had all of our DCF staff engage in a 4-module series, which aimed to raise awareness of our implicit biases and its consequences offered by the Kirwan Institute. It was a self-directed website that has been provided here for anyone who is interested in taking that implicit bias training. Our phase 2 was we contracted with Dr. Jessica Price, a national leader and expert in providing trainings on the role of race equity in child welfare, and designed a 4-part virtual training series. In that training series that all of our DCF staff have taken, the training, it was entitled Transforming Child Welfare Services Through Anti-Racism. It was also attended and offered to all of our providers and stakeholders after the DCF staff had taken it. The 4 modules included talking about history, power and privilege, the mindset shifting, and having a courageous leadership. It also talked about an anti-racist community framework. This training was part of us developing and continuing to increase our knowledge and understanding around the impact that implicit bias has on our outcomes for our children and families. This is also leading to some of the other work happening. We have created a forum for staff to hold virtual conversations, what we call courageous conversations virtually with our staff. What we have is small groups are coming together after these modules of training to talk about their experiences, to have an opportunity for them to be able to process how the impact of this data and information and this increased awareness has on their day-to-day, and for us to strategize and talk about next steps and what else we can do to improve the work. Our phase 3 brings us to Joyce James, who Commissioner Bayer talked about today, is a national child welfare and race equity expert who will be coming on now to talk to us about her phase 3 work that is happening with the with DCF. Really excited to move forward with this work and think that we're in a really good place right now when we talk about this to really start to see some improvements across the board for our children and families in New Jersey. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Ms. Racine and Commissioner Byers. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to begin to be engaged in this work, especially in a place where the leadership has made a real commitment to addressing these issues. You are already using the language that is so critical to moving to creating this anti-racist culture that you've been talking about. So a lot of work has been done, the foundation has been set, and what I hope to bring to you all is my personal experience of working to make large-scale change in systems and institutions as it relates to undoing the racial inequities that exist across all helping systems for the same population. My approach to the work in New Jersey is going to be to really begin to move us to the creation of that anti-racist culture and the accountability for which the foundation has been set. There's already been quite a bit of work that's been done around having staff be introduced to training and different workshops related to implicit bias. And my approach and understanding around this is that it is very, very important and critical that we all have an opportunity to get in touch with our implicit bias. But it is not sufficient to stop there. And that's why I'm so excited that you all are not stopping there. I will be introducing my groundwater analysis of racial inequities. It will guide the work that my team and I will do to begin to dig deeper, to move away from implicit bias, from having the conversations, to really beginning to understand and be clear about the challenges and the barriers and what I call the fences that have to be identified and removed in order to achieve the outcomes. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's work that's already been done, but it is so critical that we understand the different forms of racism, and these are just a few examples of the forms of racism that will help us to develop what I call that racial equity lens. As helping professionals, we come to our work to help and not to harm. And I do my work from that belief. But I'm also clear that without an analysis and an understanding of institutional and structural racism, what it means, a common language to talk about it, that we cannot make the kind of progress that we'd like to make. And we have for a very long time focused on what I call the tip of the iceberg, individual racism. Those individual acts of meanness, hatred, and bigotry, the things that we can see. And my approach will not deal specifically with individual racism. It will rather deal with issues around institutional racism. So we will go to the next two slides, actually, 2 slides farther. We're not going to talk a lot about individual. I really believe that people who come to work in helping professions come to help and not to harm. But if we only look at it from the individual and personal level, then we don't see what's below the surface, the institutional racism, which I know has already been talked about quite a bit, and you already have many examples of that in your work that you're doing. But we're talking about those things that happen as a result of policy and practice that intentionally or not produces outcomes that chronically favor or put a racial group at a disadvantage. The evidence of that is in the data that was just presented. And just to be clear, you know, what you see in your system is not unique to New Jersey Department of Children and Families. We see the same outcomes for the same populations of children, youth, and families in all of our helping systems all across the country. That in itself should really cause us to be more intentional and deliberate about doing what I call turning the mirror inward to examine the policy and the practices across our institutions that are keeping these outcomes in place in spite of how we work and all of the different programs and services that we put in place. Next slide, please. And just in the work that we will do with the staff and different departments, we will be identifying, becoming clear about what institutional racism actually looks like inside of our systems. We will be talking about structural racism and really beginning to look at how that lives and breathes through a long history and culture that has lived within our systems and institutions that have continued to allow privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adopt over time. And again, just to emphasize the fact that we work really hard to alter these outcomes. We come to work so that we will have good outcomes for all of the populations that we serve. But absent an understanding of the history of these things that have been maintained over generations and the norms that continue to work to perpetuate racial group inequities, then we may want to do our best work and we may want to bring our best selves to the work. But if we're not clear in examining how we've been socialized to think about race and how when we really dig deep into looking at all the factors, that race is a strong predictor of a person's outcomes across systems and institutions. And so we will do work to really look at the history. And I know that there's been a lot of work done by Dr. Carol Spiedner. She's one of my heroes in this work, especially related to her understanding of the history of the racial inequities in child welfare. But we're going to go deeper and use your data to drive your strategies and really to become clearer through a racial equity lens where we can begin to talk in terms of, yes, this is what we've been doing, but now I can see this differently. I have a different understanding of the work that we really must do to shift and alter the data that continues to show the disproportionality as it relates to African-American children in particular. If we could go to the next slide. And go to the next one, please. And so structural racialization is not something that we often talk about. And in the sessions that I'll do with the staff, we'll have many examples of what this means. That structural racialization is actually a different way of understanding the inequitable conditions and the policies and the practices that created these racialized outcomes in our communities and our systems, and the institutional arrangements that have maintained the outcomes. And so we will delve deep into how structures unevenly distribute benefits and our burdens, and that the benefits and our burdens in the way that they're distributed by systems have racialized meaning. And that kind of rolls up into the data that we see. That we see that race has a meaning in terms of who has the best outcomes and who has the worst outcomes. And we'll spend a lot of time on that. I want to quickly just share with you, if we go to the next slide, the components of this groundwater analysis. And I'm going to just do a quick run of this because these are some of the observations about racial inequities that will guide the ongoing work that we will do. And I've already said it, racial inequity looks the same across all of our helping systems. And we have to understand why that is. And understanding the why will only come through our willingness to be transparent and vulnerable enough to examine old thinking, old attitudes, old assumptions, and stereotypes that we often are not consciously aware that they're there. And we need to be able to do that in a way that shifts us away from thinking about solving problems as it relates to what's wrong with the people we serve, and begin to do that, becoming a critical lover of our systems and institutions. Loving the work that we have chosen to do so much that there are no pieces of it that we're unwilling to critically examine and consider delving deeper into policy, practice, making sure that we're providing the support and professional development that staff need to be able to get to a place where we have an accountable institutional culture that has supported every member to the extent that there is no place for racism inside of our systems. We have to understand how systems contribute to the disparities. If we only saw it in one place, we might be able to say it's about the people. But the fact that we see the inequities across all of our systems for the same population of people tell us that we must do that deeper analysis of our systems. We also have to be consciously aware that we have to move away from the one bad apple response. That it's not about a few bad caseworkers, it's not about a few bad administrators, it's not about a few bad judges, it's not about a few bad educators, it's not about a few bad doctors or physicians. We have to understand that bad apples cannot exist in an anti-racist culture. And so we have to go deeper and create that institutional accountability that will be so clear and visible within the system that those bad apples will start to stand out, and they may even begin to weed themselves out, recognizing that the values that they bring are no longer associated with the values of the system. And we'll do a lot of work around that. We also know that poor outcomes are concentrated. As you look at your data, you can probably narrow down to zip code and community level of where the disparities exist, and you will be able to also see the collective impact of systems and institutions on the same communities and the same populations. And we will have to spend a lot of time understanding why we can't respond to these communities from a place of equality, right? We can only work from a place of equality if we have all had the same opportunities and if we have all started at the same place. And so once we understand that, we know that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that we have to examine even how we have been socialized to think about the why of the existence of poor outcomes that we can isolate to the community level. We have often thought about it in terms of it's about people. You know, they're poor because they're lazy, because they like living off of government assistance and our tax dollars. Well, when we understand people's relationships to systems that come every day in the name of help, yet when we examine the data and outcomes for every one of those systems, we still see the racial inequities. That will help us to re-examine how we've been socialized. And then lastly, the fifth component is the one that is about hope. We have to have hope that we can make the kind of changes that we work so hard. The reasons why we chose our professions in the first place is to help. And so what I know from my own experience of working and leading change in systems and the work that I currently do across the country is that if we put the right kind of systemic interventions and training in place, that we can change thinking, we can reduce disproportionality and disparities, and we can improve outcomes for all populations. And the foundation for that is already being set at New Jersey Department of Children and Families. And so we know that this work is about raising the bar for those who have the worst of outcomes. But when we do that, our ultimate goal is that our systems get better at serving all populations. And I have also seen that happen inside of systems. And so I'm really looking forward to working with all of you. And I'm so excited that you're doing the engaging of all of your partners and providers, because that is what will lead to you ultimately being able to achieve the outcomes that you all work so very hard every day to achieve for children, youth, and families. Thank you. So this last slide is just captures what I said, that if we put the right kind of training in place, training that is defined by anti-racist principles, that we will begin to see a shift in the institutional culture. Those shifts will help staff at every level to understand institutional and systemic racism. It will help us to understand and value the history and culture and partnership of community, of family, of youth. And we will work to create accountability internally as well as externally in our relationships. And that's when change will start to happen in decision patterns and interventions. And I'm looking forward to being part of that journey with the leadership and staff at all levels of Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sandy Starr, Assistant Commissioner with the Division of Family and Community Partnerships at DCF. And I'm going to spend a few minutes speaking with you about our work around planning for the Universal Home Visiting Law. Next slide, please. So Governor Murphy signed the newborn home visiting bill into law on July 29th, making New Jersey the second state in the country behind Oregon to have statewide universal home visiting offered to every newborn and parent in the state. And in New Jersey, there are slightly more than 100,000 births each year. And that provides this program with an incredible potential to have impact on both maternal and infant morbidity and mortality, but also in reducing the occurrence of child abuse and neglect. Now, this slide, it's very busy and it's very tiny, and I know that you can't read it, but I thought it was important enough to leave it here anyway. So let me just say that this is a depiction of the current landscape of early childhood services in the state, from basic health care, from prenatal care to postpartum care, through early childhood care and pediatric visits, through more moderate and intensive supports that include our existing 3 home visiting models: Nurse Family Partnership, Parents as Teachers, and Healthy Families America. The graphic represents a continuum, a combination of medical services, community supports, and social services. It includes referral sources from OBGYN practices to the Department of Health's community health workers. It includes access infrastructure, such as our central intakes and the New Jersey Parent Link. It includes planning infrastructure, including county councils for young children, Nurture New Jersey, ACNJ's leadership of the Pritzker Children's Initiative, Unlocking Potential, and Think Babies Coalition, and so on. And despite the fact that the slide might be too busy to make out all of the detail on your computer screens, I wanted to start with it because this new program, this Universal Home Visiting, really does need to be nested and integrated within this range of existing programs and services to really have impact and to provide synergy with the existing programs. Next slide, please. So let me give you a brief overview of what this law consists of. The New Jersey Universal Newborn Home Visiting Law is a statewide effort. It's a voluntary program that needs to be delivered in a culturally competent manner. It offers home nurse visitation services in every community in the state for all newborn infants and all parents of a newborn infant residing in the community in which the program operates, including resource family parents, adoptive parents, and parents experiencing a stillbirth. It includes at least 1 nurse home visit in the participating newborn infant's home within 2 weeks after the birth of an infant, and it requires the visit be conducted by a registered nurse or an advanced practice nurse. In addition to that first visit within 2 weeks of birth, the law also calls for up to 2 additional visits within the first 90 days following birth. Next slide, please. Now, the model that's adopted must be based on criteria established by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for evidence-based early childhood home visiting service deliveries. It includes evidence-based evaluation of physical, emotional, and social factors affecting parents, including health and wellness checks of the newborn and an assessment of the physical and mental health of the person who has given birth. It provides support services to parents of newborn infants, and it's to coordinate with each hospital and birthing center. Slide, please. Now, this law requires that no expense be incurred by families to take advantage of this benefit. And so a great deal of work is going to center around making sure that there is coverage through insurance and Medicaid. And I won't go through all of these pieces and parts, but we'll be working closely with the Department of Human Services to provide Medicaid coverage, the State Benefits Commission to provide benefits under the State Health Benefits Plan, and again, Human Services to ensure that state plan amendments or waivers are available to implement through the state Medicaid effort. Next slide, please. So other things that this law requires us to do, it requires the Department of Children and Families to appoint an advisory committee, and DCF can consult, coordinate, and collaborate with that advisory group in the development of the program. And we'll come back to that in a few, but that advisory group has already been appointed and we've begun meeting. It also grants DCF the authority to develop a plan for the managed rollout of the program. And in consultation with the Departments of Banking and Insurance and Human Services, establish criteria for the coverage of services provided under this program by insurance carriers offering health benefits plans in the state, ensuring that the program meets the needs of residents in each community that the program operates. Next slide, please. It also requires the department, in consultation with the Department of Health, to develop resource guides about information for this program that can be distributed to parents and inform them about the program and their rights to schedule a nurse visit. Next slide. Another major component of this legislation is the requirement around evaluation of the effort. And it directs the Department of Children and Families to evaluate, measure, and improve the effectiveness of the program, work with other state departments and agencies, health insurance carriers, birthing facilities, local public health authorities, maternal health consortia, home visitation programs, community-based organizations, and social service providers to develop protocols for data sharing, including data sharing with primary care providers. And the legislation enables the department to contract with a third-party vendor to assist with this evaluation effort. Next slide. So our planned approach involves model selection, teaming structure. We've been discussing some anticipated challenges, and then, as that first slide indicated, ensuring that there's integration of this universal home visiting within existing programming and planning efforts. Now, with regard to model selection, noted earlier that this model needed to fall within the purview of HHS designated evidence-based home visiting programs. And if you visit the Health and Human Services website that lists these programs out, you'll see that HHS reviewed approximately 50 programs, and of those 50 that were reviewed, 21 were determined to be evidence-based, that met the criteria that HHS laid out. And of those 21, there's only actually one program that meets all of the requirements that this legislation puts in place in terms of the requirement that this be a nurse, an RN, that does the visiting, that it occurs within the first several weeks of birth, that it includes up to 3 visits, and that would be Family Connects. Next slide, please. So this is our proposed teaming structure. We have our advisory group, which met for the first time early September, and will be meeting again within days. And off of that advisory group, we've developed 6 work groups. We don't have that steering team quite in place yet, but we do have the 6 work groups in place. And by the end of this week, all 6 of those work groups will have met. But that includes an insurance work group to begin the lift of bringing Medicaid and insurance carriers to the table. The data collection, evaluation, and CQI work group. Also a communication and marketing group. We want to make certain that every family in the state, regardless of socioeconomic status, knows that this is a benefit and an advantage that a program that they can take advantage of, regardless of what community they live in and what their socioeconomic status is. We also have a model implementation work group. While there are givens that have to be implemented for an evidence-based approach, there are also areas for evidence-based programs that can be New Jerseyized, if you will. So how we actually bring this program into the fold with our other existing programs is something that we will be actively working on through our model implementation effort. Financing. Not every single insurance carrier is regulated by the Department of Banking and Insurance. There are exceptions. For example, companies that are self-insured. So there are insurance companies that may fall outside of the purview of this legislation. There will also be uninsured families that are undocumented, and we need to ensure that there is a way to finance the effort so that every family has the same access to these services. The final work group is the nursing pipeline. There is already a nursing shortage nationally as well as in New Jersey. And the capacity for this program to bring nurses on board is really going to dictate how quickly we can move forward across the state with this effort. Next slide, please. And speaking of that challenge, here are some challenges and drivers that are going to determine the pace of this plan and implementation. The first is the labor supply of RNs. And the chart that's here shows that before the pandemic, in 2000, I believe it was 17, New Jersey ranks behind Texas and California in terms of a state with the most severe shortages of RNs. So this is not a list that you want to be at the top of, or even in third place. So this is going to be a challenge. If every family took advantage of this program, we would need approximately 240 RNs statewide to provide the engine to make this program work. Again, messaging that I mentioned already to prevent stigma and ensure that everyone sees this as a valuable service and a benefit that they're entitled to. There are also timeframes for state procurement processes that we have to take into consideration, whether that's bringing on board an evaluation entity or Family Connects or any other contract. It will take some time. We're also expecting that it will take some time to develop the data infrastructure for this effort. While the department has been directed to provide the evaluation and to work with other entities, there is no mandate that those other entities provide data. We'll have our work cut out for us over the coming months. There is also the time frame for finalizing those data sharing agreements. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our examination of financing to ensure that families that are not going to be covered through insurance or Medicaid still have full access to this effort. Next slide, please. So where are we right now? Right now, our advisory group is meeting bi-monthly, and that can change depending upon need. We've convened our work groups. So the planning has commenced, And we are also in the process right now of procuring an external entity to support this work necessary for a successful planned rollout. There are a lot of moving parts, and we're looking for some additional assistance to make sure that we continue having a smooth glide path to this effort. There are a lot of questions about how quickly this will be implemented. Don't have a good time frame for this yet, but I hope that you can see from this very brief overview of the legislation and our teaming efforts that there's a lot of groundwork and infrastructure that needs to be laid to ensure that we have a successful rollout. Okay, next slide. All right, so re-engineering our school-linked services. So New Jersey's school-based youth services programs are recognized for being the first substantial state effort to facilitate student success by linking schools and social services. And the programs were initially funded by the New Jersey legislature in 1988. There was a $6 million earmark designed to help get things moving with school-based youth services programs. And so these programs have been in operation for more than 30 years. And we thought maybe it was time to kind of re-examine those programs and dust them off and see what we could do to improve those services. And especially now, as students are coming back to school with the pandemic, and nationally, if you're looking at the news, you can see that students some students are struggling with the return to school, and it's just another reason that we want to make certain that these programs are working as well as they possibly can. Now, the programs have often been described to me as being organic, that they can change to meet the immediate needs of students. And flexibility and adaptability are certainly strengths of programs. But as it may be one of the major strengths of these programs, it also is perhaps one of their biggest challenges. Because as we know, that programs or businesses or services that try to be all things to all people maybe haven't clarified who their customer is, what their core strategies are, and what they need to do to ensure achieving successful outcomes. So this creates some challenges, particularly in evaluating the effectiveness of these programs and ensuring that there's a degree of uniformity in terms of access to services for students across the state and across the school districts that have these programs. Since their inception, there have been advances in evidence-based approaches, changing student needs, shifts in academic landscape and community services. And so it really is time to review and update the array of services to ensure that they're not only recognized for longevity, but also for their effectiveness in meeting the needs of students today and into the future. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by school-linked services? These are services that include currently 91 school-based youth services programs, 5 health centers, 3 family-friendly centers, 3 prevention of juvenile delinquency programs, 10 parent linking programs, and 8 adolescent pregnancy prevention initiative programs. And the department contracts with private nonprofit organizations and school districts to provide prevention and supportive services for elementary, middle, and high school students. And the programs in general aim to build on the strengths of young people so that they can achieve their educational and life goals. The school-based youth services programs are located in host schools and coordinate with existing resources in the community. All youth are eligible to participate in those services that might include mental health counseling, employment counseling, substance abuse education and prevention, preventative health awareness, including pregnancy prevention, primary medical linkages, learning support, healthy youth development, recreation, and information and referral. Our 5 school-based health centers associated with the school-based youth services programs are all located in the NERC school districts. And they provide primary medical, dental, and behavioral health care services to students and families up to age 21. And the services are available to members of the school's surrounding community. Our family-friendly centers, 38 of them, are located in host schools to enhance before and after school programming in elementary and middle schools. They all emphasize positive youth development, encourage parental participation, and seek to establish partnerships with school and community stakeholders. The three prevention of juvenile delinquency programs, also located, I believe, in northern New Jersey, focus specifically on juvenile delinquency prevention strategies and self-regulation skills to prevent juvenile delinquent behaviors that can impede the students' achievement of their education and life goals. Our parent linking programs located in high schools are designed for expecting and parenting teen mothers and fathers to minimize or eliminate barriers to earning a high school diploma, keeping young people who are pregnant and raising infants in school. And our adolescent pregnancy prevention initiative open to all youth enrolled in the host schools where there was a concern about behaviors that could lead to an unplanned pregnancy. Next slide, please. So we formed a stakeholders group, and that stakeholders group met in August to be introduced to the process that we're going to use to re-engineer these services, to be introduced to the process and timeline. DCF has contracted with the Center for Healthcare Strategies to facilitate the stakeholder process and develop a report and recommendations. And this group will reconvene in the coming weeks to help us respond to the questions that you can see on the slide. But basically, we're looking at how do we improve access, how do we reach more students, how do we improve linkages to community services, how can we better emphasize a risk and protectives model and evidence-based strategies, and importantly, what outcomes and with what target populations are we designing these programs? And based on those outcomes and target populations, what should the staffing and staffing qualifications look like? Next slide, please. The product that we'd like to see from this stakeholders group and from the work that we're doing with CHCS will be an action plan that will identify student needs and priorities, identify parent supports to aid in school success, support the development of an operational definition of success that reflects parent and student priorities and DCF requirements, identify barriers, facilitators, and opportunities to achieving our goals, and promoting evidence-based prevention strategies that facilitate youth success in school. Next slide, please. So our time frame, as I said, our stakeholders group met for the first time in August to be introduced to this work. And we're right now in phase 1 of this effort, which is information and data gathering. The Center for Healthcare Strategies has completed an environmental scan of state-level school-linked service programs and initiatives, so around, whether it's state level or a smaller jurisdiction. But we've kind of got a lay of the land across the country about what other states and local jurisdictions are doing with school-linked services. We are currently having CHCS hold a series of focus groups with key groups, including students, parents, school administrators, community programs, school-linked service representatives, State Department representatives, and others to get different perspectives on student needs and understand expectations regarding school-linked services. Most importantly, though, in this mix of voices is the voice of students, and we're putting the voice of students front and center in this effort. So our focus groups right now are still ongoing. We will soon reconvene our stakeholder group. Maybe December now and not November, but it's coming up. But the stakeholder group will have available to it a summary of the findings of the focus groups, as well as the environmental scan to reflect on as we respond to the questions that we're trying to have responded to. January and February, phase 3, we'll have a draft and begin to finalize the report with recommendations. And then by end of February, beginning of March, we'll be able to begin implementing the recommendations that are included in the report. So these are two really major lifts that we are in the process of moving forward with: our universal home visiting program and our school-linked services. So I think that's my last slide. If it isn't, it'll be a surprise. And I get to introduce everyone to a 5-minute break. Thank you very much.
So welcome back, everybody. I'm just got to go ahead. So we're wrapping up our 5-minute break. My name is Brian Ross. I am the Assistant Commissioner at DCF for Policy Oversight and Regulatory Affairs. I'm here today to talk about some of our childcare licensing initiatives, and very happy for the opportunity to do so. Really a lot of exciting things happening in the childcare space right now. And we may need to talk quickly about some of those. I'm very happy to be joined today too by my colleague from the Department of Human Services, Division of Family Development, Assistant Commissioner Natasha Johnson. And she'll be talking about some initiatives that are happening down there too. They're also extremely exciting, just a lot going on in childcare right now. So if I could move to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So just to give those of you who, I know we've got a lot of participants on the call today. So those who aren't entirely familiar with the childcare sector in New Jersey, I want to let everybody know that we license a little over, and it's a little bit of a fluid number, 4,100 childcare centers on a normal basis, plus 1,300 and change family childcare homes that operate in private settings for 6 or fewer children. More than 400,000 children attend on a daily basis statewide. And licensed centers employ approximately 90,000 workers. An estimated 90% of those are female. And that represents, by our math, approximately 5% of of all working women in the state. So 1 in 20 women who are working in the state of New Jersey is employed in a licensed childcare center, which is pretty significant. If I can move on to the next slide. So, the challenge that we're looking at, and the New York Times, this was October 10th, actually had it right there on the front page, that we are looking right now as we come out of the pandemic, and even before the pandemic, that we really have a situation across the country, across the state, that we're dealing with extremely high prices for childcare and still low wages for teachers, that the folks who are providing the care are not seeing those high tuition rates reflected in their salaries or their pay. And it's something that obviously has an impact on the quality and the availability of childcare across the state, and something that we believe in the long-term sense needs to be addressed in order to sustain the vital childcare market that exists out there. Next slide, please. And so I do want to make sure we point out, and because this is important, childcare in New Jersey is already pretty good, if not great, whatever superlative adjective you'd choose to use there. We have some of the most stringent childcare standards in the country. And when they last ranked those, this was the National Trade Association, they ranked the stringency of the childcare standards across the country. Only Massachusetts was better than New Jersey. And I think we've come a little ways since then too, that we're even probably right on par with what Massachusetts is requiring. And New Jersey's childcare is also, and I know the parents who are out there amongst you are going to roll their eyes at this because it doesn't seem possible, but relative to the rest of the country and relative to the median income in New Jersey's childcare is actually relatively affordable at this point at only $13,000 a year on average. For reference, Massachusetts, who I talked about before, who has the more stringent standards than we do, allegedly, childcare there runs an average of $20,000 a year. And in some of our major cities, even nearby in Washington, D.C., New York City, that you're running into the $20,000 and $30,000 a year for childcare pretty routinely. And also in New Jersey, we do have a very generous subsidy program under the TANF program that Natasha will talk about momentarily. Next slide, please. So our goal here at DCF, which is to look at the childcare field and what we need to do to put it on stable footing for the future, to increase wages, create flexibility, and make sure that we do all of that without increasing the cost of care, without sacrificing quality, and without displacing the core of the existing workforce. We want to make sure we create that flexibility in order to better meet the needs of New Jersey's families and be better prepared for whatever the world may throw at us in the future, whether that be a pandemic situation, whether that be a superstorm or hurricane situation, or whatever else the fates may have in store for us as we move forward here, that the childcare industry is in a position to adjust to that. Next slide. So our plan for how we propose to do that is a combination of occupational licensing for childcare staff coupled with regulatory relief. We want to shift the cost of operating a childcare center in large sense to that staffing model, to push more of that money that's being paid in tuition and more of those operating expenses that are being devoted to childcare to the staff that are providing the care, and offer some regulatory relief to offset those costs. Next slide, please. I apologize, my slides are transitioning a little bit slowly. This one's got a few words on it, that may be why. So the system we're envisioning in the long term will be an examination-based system, similar to what you'll see for the system for elementary and secondary schools, and also in place for across the state of New Jersey, 209 other professions, where there is a license actually issued to a person who is going to be providing the service or working in that occupation to test the skills, knowledge, and experience that they have. And that license will be issued to the person. That'll be a searchable database that's available for the public to see. And we'll ensure that we have high quality staff that have the skills that they need to provide the highest quality care across the state. It really shifts our focus away from being very zeroed in on child care center physical facilities and buildings, and really puts the onus where we think it should be, which is on the people who are actually providing the care. We think that when push comes to shove, that is always the most important factor. And we think that's where the attention of the state, of the regulatory community, and the public needs to be. So that is our goal, is to push in that direction. And I apologize, I'm moving a little bit quickly here. I won't read all of these words because we want to make sure we get to some of the more exciting work that's being done a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So occupational licensing, and this here really is just kind of to make the very brief case for why we think it's important, why we think it will help. Most prominently, most importantly, we think it will increase wages. We have research that says that meaningful occupational licenses correlate to a wage increase of as much as 18%. On an hourly basis, we see that the median unlicensed worker is earning approximately $18 an hour, which those of you in the childcare field will know is actually pretty high for childcare right now. The average wages across the field are much closer to minimum wage right now. But across workers, meaningful occupational licensing pushes that average hourly wage from $18.80 up to $25. It increases tenure by as much as 19%. It actually improves representation and equity because the wage gap between licensed and unlicensed workers in the same profession is right now greatest for women and for African American and Hispanic workers across all occupations. And the license mitigates reliance on subjective judgments and prejudices and internalized biases that impact selection bias, and does create a meaningful reduction in racial and ethnic discrimination in hiring practices. So we found that the license does actually increase equity and representation across the field. Next slide, please. And I just like to include this slide because it really does, I think, more starkly than anything else, point to the precarious position that we have childcare workers in this state right now as far as the wages they're being paid. You can see all of those professions that are selected largely at random, just to give a representative sampling. Those are other professions that are licensed in the state of New Jersey. Those are folks who have to have an occupational license in order to do that job. As I said before, there are 209 other professions, not including childcare workers right now, that have to be licensed. And you can see those wages are all substantially higher than the average annual salary of childcare workers, which we have possibly dated number about $21,067. So landscape architects, tree experts, even private school and public school teachers earning substantially more than childcare workers. Next slide, please. And occupational licensing has, other benefits too that are not quite the same headline, but definitely have appeal to us. There's a long-term career track here that makes the sector more attractive to potential employees. We know right now that the childcare sector and folks who are hiring within it are competing against the Amazons of the world, the Walmarts of the world, other people who need a lot of employees at relatively low wages. And we want to make childcare a more attractive career track for the folks who are willing to dedicate their time and make a career out of it. And we hope we can build that. The publicly verifiable occupational license is also, we're hoping, going to have some spillover effect into the unregulated childcare market. So for those of you who aren't aware right now, nannies, babysitters, other folks who might be providing childcare, particularly on an in-home basis or on private arrangement, there really is no regulation. There is no way to verify background checks. There are online resources, but they're not nearly as thorough as what we require for childcare staff right now, which are the most thorough in the state. It's one of the only professions where the full gamut of criminal background checks at the state and federal level are required, in addition to a DCF child abuse registry check. So we're hopeful that with a system that allows anyone in the general public to verify the validity and currentness of a occupational license for a childcare worker, that will have some impact on those private markets and allow us to make sure that children and families, whatever their childcare preferences are, whatever they're using, would be able to take advantage of that. It does help us with enforcement, and I won't get into that in too much detail because it's sort of a very esoteric thing. But we also, the thing that we really are kind of excited about is just the flexibility this would bring us for future crises. So those of you who were around and remember back Superstorm Sandy, even before the pandemic, where we had issues where childcare centers were evacuated and flooded in fairly large sectors of the state. And it became difficult to open up a new childcare center to support folks who were living in emergency shelters because we had focused so heavily on the physical structures and on the employees being attached to that. And this would allow us to, at least the same way that hospitals and medical personnel can set up a field hospital, it would really make the process of setting up field childcare much more readily available to us. Next slide, please. So I do want to address, and because it is, I see there's a question here in the chat from Mary McManus. I just want to deviate on just a little bit too, because she does ask a great question, and it's one that we've definitely been very focused on. She says, so all childcare workers who did not continue their schooling due to lack of success in schools will be pushed out of these jobs? And no, that's absolutely not what we're looking to do. And we're making a concerted effort to focus in on examination and testing for skills and knowledge that can be built in the childcare sector. So we are really very focused on making sure that we do everything we can to not displace the community and the workforce that is providing childcare services right now. So the goal is to not zero in on higher education, to not have degree requirements, to not have requirements or credentialing based on education and processes to that, but to really focus in on the presence of those skills so that we have, the anecdotal situation that we've dealt with before. And we'll talk about that in a couple seconds here on the next slides. New Jersey is the only state right now that has a 4-year degree requirement for a childcare center director. We were the first state to implement that. And to this date, I believe we are still the only state that has implemented that. That's the kind of thing we're looking to move away from, is a strictly educational secondary credential that's based on higher education, and really move into a situation where the teacher who's been working for a decade in a childcare center, who may have a high school diploma, may not even have a high school diploma, but has provided this service, has learned on the job, has the skills, has the knowledge, is able to take the examination, sit for it, take the test, pass it, and become a director if they want to, or become a teacher, or move up within the field without having to rely on formal education if that's not the most appropriate way to gauge these things. So I absolutely agree, Mary. That's a great question, and it's something that we're very focused on making sure we don't do, is displace that workforce. But yes, and that kind of gets into here when we talk about regulatory reform or increasing the wages of childcare staff. The big concern is that we're going to not only displace the workforce, but pass the cost of those higher wages on to families. And the last thing we want to do in this state or any other state is increase the cost of childcare. So what we are looking into and evaluating right now, and these will come out as regulatory proposals, but just to give you an idea where we're kind of zeroing in on, is looking to formalize those trade-offs. So that if you do employ staff who have documented skills, who are demonstrably better at their jobs, are able to provide their jobs in a way that provides a higher level of care, that there are certain things in our regulations that may be costly that we can start to ease off on for centers. Next slide, please. So two of the big things we're looking at, and this is sort of I would say that sorry, next slide. Perfect. So the big sacred cow within childcare really is the staff to child ratio, that you need X number of staff for this many children. We've really looked at the research pretty hard at this point and found that there isn't a lot of real hard science behind those numbers. Now, when we talk about something ridiculous, you can't have one staff with 30 kids, but within an acceptable range that's sort of spelled out across the states within the union, we do see that there is a huge amount of variation in what those ratios look like. New Jersey does tend towards the median. We really haven't deviated higher or lower in any one direction. But we found that the states that have not seen negative outcomes. It does not jeopardize safety. It does not jeopardize program quality. It doesn't jeopardize long-term outcomes. And this isn't just states that are, those of you who've dealt with regulations know there are some states that are much more laissez-faire about the way they regulate industries, and there's some that are more like New Jersey, and that they tend to be very minute in some of the things that they zero in on. But even Massachusetts, which you'll recall from an earlier slide, is one of those states that was identified as having more stringent requirements than New Jersey, has ratios that are a little looser than what we have too. So there is room to maneuver there. And there is, we've seen in the research, a substantial cost savings for every bit of movement on that ratio. So moving from a, for example, 5-to-1 ratio of kids to a 6-to-1 ratio can save up to 20%. Now, obviously, there are other factors there, particularly with infants, where that ratio is 1-to-4, and that's pretty standard across the country because it's related to the fire code. But we are looking at ways to add some flexibility with those other age groups. And they talked about, in response to that question too, I also, educational requirements are a thing that we are extremely interested in looking at and zeroing in on, making sure that those requirements, where they do exist, are absolutely necessary and related to what we're trying to achieve, and to try and move towards an assessment of skills and knowledge that isn't based so much on the procurement of higher education at a cost, and is something that we can assess and document and license based on the job knowledge. So, and that's just two areas that we're looking at right now, and assessing what the cost savings would look like so that we can offset that, and again, hopefully push some more money towards those staff wages, which we would like to see increased. Next slide, please. And we'd also know, and again, this is a more esoteric to the folks who are in the childcare industry, which I know is not this whole audience, but we also think that just the presence of the occupational license and some of the things that does related to the background checks and making staff readily able to work immediately will actually reduce staffing costs overall by as much as 20%. Next slide, please. And so we are also, and very excited, and I think this is of more interest to this audience too, we are working, and we thank the governor's office and the federal government and folks for really supporting us on this front, pushing some research in partnership with our New Jersey universities out over the next several months to really focus in on a couple of areas that are of interest to the childcare community and the childcare field. One of which is an assessment of the childcare availability across the state. And we really are interested, and I think Cynthia Rice and Seal are both on here, obviously, we'd like to build on some of the research they've done at ACNJ to really explore where childcare deserts exist in the state of New Jersey, find out how that lines up with parental preferences to make sure that we are providing childcare options to families that actually meet their needs, rather than trying to provide care that just checks a box and makes childcare available that doesn't actually meet the needs. So we're looking at things like after-hours care, weekend care, extended care, or if it really is just a matter of we need to extend and register and regulate more family childcare homes. So that, and they're also going to be looking at the availability of care across the state, and assessment of preferences of the families across the state. And we're also very interested in just building a profile of the workforce that we have out there, finding out what it is that draws people to this industry, what it is that keeps them in the industry, what gets people to start businesses as childcare centers and keep at it. We know for a lot of workers within the field, it is not an exclusively financial appeal that this industry has, that there are other reasons to get involved, and we'd really like to understand those better. So we're hoping through the combination of these two projects that we will have a much better picture of what childcare looks like across the state fairly quickly. Next slide, please. Excellent. So with that, I'd like to pass off to my colleague, again, Natasha Johnson, the Assistant Commissioner of DHS's Division of Family Development, who has some exciting things to talk about on the childcare front on their end. So, Natasha.
Thanks, Brian, and good morning to everyone. Happy to be here today to join my colleagues at the Department of Children and Families and our colleagues over at the at ACNJ. So I'd just like to take a few minutes to talk to you about the childcare initiatives that we've been implementing since the start of the pandemic. Next slide, please. My first two slides are going to review some of the earlier initiatives that started as early as March of 2020. So after declaring a state of emergency, the governor ordered very early on that childcare centers needed to close. But there was an acknowledgement and knowing that there was a need for childcare for children of essential workers. So we did stand up an emergency childcare program very early in the pandemic so that essential workers were able to continue to work. We also in the early months extended care for families already receiving assistance from us for their school-age children who typically under our normal program only received before and after care, but needed full-time care because of school closures. So we were able to provide that for parents that needed that assistance. We also started a new program for families whose incomes were higher than our regular assistance program to support their childcare needs. Next slide, please. So we also provided very early on a number of health, safety, and stabilization grants to support providers and provided additional assistance to those providers who serve children in our assistance program by paying them based on enrollment and not attendance, and providing a supplemental payment in addition to their regular payment to continue to help support their needs. Next slide, please. So we're now moving into the next phase of our support, which includes support, again, for childcare providers, but also includes support for parents and employees in the childcare community. Next slide. We started with a rate increase for providers who serve children in our childcare assistance program with an average of a 25% rate increase that is starting, that will go back to November 1st. And this will also support providers as they look forward to the minimum wage increase that will begin in January. And I know Seal talked about that very early on in this presentation. So this increase will help with just basic needs and then also addressing the minimum wage increase in January. We're also going to be providing a number of incentives for providers to participate in our quality rating and improvement system, which is called Grow NJ Kids. And that will include financial incentives to bring family childcare providers into that system. Next slide. One of the biggest things that we're going to be doing related to stabilizing childcare providers is 2 rounds of stabilization grants. So they're going to be available to providers, and they will range from $20,000 to $80,000 based on the capacity of that center. These stabilization grants will also be available to family childcare providers at $2,000 each. Next slide. We heard a lot last year from summer youth camp providers in their need to also be supported. And so we did provide some support for them last summer, and will continue through 2 rounds of grants that will be available to them for the next 2 summers to also help them make sure that kids are safe during the summer. Next slide. As I mentioned before, as we're moving forward, we made a conscious effort to make sure that as we're providing support, it hits multiple areas. So for providers, for parents, for employees at childcare, in the childcare community. So this slide really talks a little bit about the things that we're going to be doing for parents. So we're going to be implementing a few initiatives to support parents. One is, so providers will continue to get an additional $300 per child per month on top of their regular rate. And the purpose of this is to reduce the out-of-pocket expenses for parents. So in other words, any fees, application costs, administrative fees, and then also with the rate increase for the providers and this stabilization rate, making sure that we're getting closer to the market rate and where our assistance rate is so that parents have to pay less out of pocket. We're also going to be waiving all copays, and for parents who need it, working towards incentivizing providers to provide non-traditional hours of care. And Brian just mentioned that a little bit in the study that they're going to be doing. And we're also going to be participating to understand what parents' needs are, and then what would be an incentive for providers to provide evening care, weekend care. We know a lot of that traditionally happens now in family childcare providers, but what would be the incentive for centers? And then what would other family childcare providers need to be incentivized to provide that as well? Next slide. For the childcare workforce, they will have an opportunity to receive 2 retention bonuses. So one would be this year for $1,000, and then one next year at an amount that's yet to be determined. We're also going to be offering recruitment bonuses of $1,000 that will be available to newly hired staff. Next slide. So just a quick slide here about, I mentioned before our quality rating improvement system, which is called Grow NJ Kids. And as a way to continue to ensure that we're providing quality childcare, we're looking to incentivize providers who are already in that process to complete it, and then to engage new providers with monetary incentives to participate, again, so that we're focused on providing quality childcare for all of our kids in care. Next slide. So I know I covered sort of a lot very quickly, and I know I wanted to stay within our time frame, but I just want to emphasize that we certainly understand the value of childcare and its impacts to parents, to children, and the economy. So we're going to continue to support and stabilize and help to stabilize this community. Thank you.
Molly, if you're talking, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm the first person to mess that one up today. So, sorry. I was just saying thank you so much to Brian and Natasha, and I'm now going to talk with you, with the group, a little bit about what's happening within the children's system of care, and particularly with our update around rates. And so without further ado, I think many folks are familiar with this, but I have some additional updates from when we first made the announcements this summer. So the Department of Children and Families recently completed a comprehensive rate rebalancing process to implement a funding increase for all of our children's system of care, Medicaid, state plan, and waiver services. Most of these rates had not been adjusted in 15 years. So this was really a historic effort on the part of the department to make these changes across the board for all of those Medicaid covered services. So the project was formally commenced in the winter of 2019 and 2020, and it was led by the Department of Children and Families Fiscal Office in collaboration with CSOC program and contracting staff and a small team of research consultants. The project included a review of contract requirements for every single service line provided through the children's system of care, and an assessment of market rates, including current salary and wage data, and the development and application of an activity-based cost methodology to establish the new rate schedule for all of our services. We then collaborated with DMAHS, the Division of Medical Assistance and Health Services, our state Medicaid authority, to submit the state plan amendment to the Federal Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This was required in order to receive approval for the updated rate methodology and to have that now incorporated into the state plan moving forward. The amendment was formally approved by CMS on August 2nd of this year, and we were very fortunate that we were able to make the rates retroactive to January 1st of 2021. So as of last week, the department has issued over $87 million in retro payments to 230 contracted provider agencies operating over 560 programs or different service lines. So this includes our out-of-home, our CMO, our mobile response, our intensive in-home and individual support services programs. Additionally, over 600 actively enrolled intensive and community provider agencies have received these retroactive payments. In our conversations with providers throughout this rate setting process, as we've provided updates to that community, we have put tremendous emphasis on the goal of ensuring that this rate increase supports competitive wages for the workforce across all of our programs and services. We've also seen, we now have budget authority for the rest of this fiscal year to support the new rate schedule. And we have seen since fiscal year 2018, we have now seen our state appropriation for these services go from just under 400 million to just under 480 million in this fiscal year, which is an annualized increase of 178 million in the last 3 years. Additionally, we've been able to provide some increased funding for our family support organizations this year. Through departmental advocacy efforts, we increased the family support organization cost reimbursement contract ceilings by a total of $3 million across the 15 agencies that are based in our areas across the state. These funds are also intended to increase workforce capacity and to support current workforce well-being by ensuring that our agencies are able to provide a full complement of benefits and resources for that workforce. Having established the new rate schedule, we are now in a very strong position to issue requests for proposals for those services that we know are in high demand. In the coming weeks, we will be sharing additional information with providers and stakeholders about service trends so that we can forecast our priorities for new service capacity and our provider agencies can be prepared to respond to these opportunities. Thank you so much. And I think it is now my pleasure to turn this over to Dave Ellis.
Good morning. And what I'm noticing is that I probably am going to have to take a new headshot because rarely has anyone ever seen me in a suit. So I will start out in that fashion. So I'm the executive director of the Office of Resilience, and we're kind of an interesting office created in June of 2020, and I was brought on board at that time with the responsibility to create a statewide action plan to address adverse childhood experiences across the state of New Jersey. We are unique and are recognized for that uniqueness by others across the country. We're constantly receiving calls asking, how can you possibly create a state level cabinet position that is not a state employee? That was a lot of brilliant work that was done with 3 foundations, Commissioner Beyer and the AG's office figuring out how to get this work done to get it to the governor's office for approval. Since that time, things have exploded. It's been 19 months since I arrived here, and my report here over the next few minutes will be a little bit different from others, as I want to give you an update on what's happening and where we're looking to go in the future. If you go ahead and go to the next slide, please. If you think about the Office of Resilience, as I said, we were started in June of 2020, and we released a statewide action plan in just February of this year. So within about 8 months, we crafted a plan that looks at New Jersey as a self-healing communities model state. And I'll get into more detail of what that is, but just suffice it to say that it is a best practice public health model for how we do this work. It's what communities who have been successful and doing work around trauma, trauma-informed, healing-centered, and prevention is what the model they use to actually be successful in doing this work. I'll also talk a little bit about the statewide awareness campaign that we released or started in April of this year, our Actions for ACEs campaign. We'll talk some about an ACEs screening position paper regarding screening of youth and families across the state of New Jersey, and we'll talk some about an innovation micro grant that I think folks have kind of captured folks' thoughts about how we can actually do this work. Next slide. And so that building self-healing communities model, we really wanted to find something that would bring community into leadership role. The design of everything that we do is about first asking the community what's important to the community. And we have tried to stick with that with everything from the development of the statewide action plan to even the development of the microgrant process that we're using. And so you see there a 4-phase iterative process that talks about leadership expansion. And so you've heard folks talk about this a lot in all of the other things as they've been reporting. But what we're talking about here is making sure that those who are most directly impacted are in a leadership and decision-making role, that in fact, they are the ones helping guide us, because who better than the folks who are directly impacted? And that we want to come together around things that are important to them. When we talk about shared learning, what we believe is that we own nothing, the community owns everything. And so it's not about, did you succeed or did you fail? The question is, what are you learning, and how do we share that out with everyone else so that we know what's going on? And the last piece around results-oriented decision-making. Oftentimes we look to research to tell us whether or not a decision or a program is working. We simply ask the community, is this something that's working for you? Number one, because I don't live in most of the communities. In fact, I am a transplant in New Jersey. And so my belief is that you and the people that are being served in the community will know what is working for them, and that they know what the results are. And those are the things that we need to look to figure out how we support. And that this is an iterative process, so it is not a one and done. We have to go back and continually make sure that those who are most impacted are in it, that we come together and share that learning, and that we look at how we make our decisions. Next slide, please. So I talked about a statewide action plan. These are the 5 core strategies that are in that action plan. One of the things you should note about this is that all 5 of those core strategies came directly from the community. They gave us the language, and literally if you look in the report, you will see their language reflected directly in each of these goals. And I'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along, but in the quick run, we're looking at how do we become trauma-informed and healing-centered. And I want folks to recognize that when we're doing this work, trauma-informed is a starting point. Being trauma-informed, most of us become informed. The question is, how do we become responsive? And then how do we move to a space of healing and eventually to a place of prevention? Because our belief is that we can prevent a lot of the self-inflicted traumas that are impacting our children, our families, and our communities. The second core strategy, looking at the public awareness campaign, and as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about that, maintaining community policy and funding priorities. That is around the micro grants, and I'll talk more about that. And provide a cross-sector ACEs training. We spend a lot of time doing training with folks, and we offer those across the state, and I'll talk a little bit more. And lastly, to look at what is trauma-informed and healing-centered services. And that also is a part of the work that we're doing. There's going to be a lot of links that will take you to different places where you can get information and resources, toolkits. So I keep seeing in the chat, will you get these slides? My belief is that you will. And if not, I can most assuredly make these links available to you one way or another. Next slide, please. So we talked about a public awareness campaign, this Actions for ACEs campaign. And what I would tell you is this is a statewide public awareness campaign. It was funded by the Burke Foundation, and it's specifically, this one specifically targets law enforcement and educators. The overall message that we want folks to understand is this, that 2 out of 3 children have at least one adverse childhood experience in their life. But 3 out of 3 adults can help. And so it's about figuring out, how do we as individuals begin to engage with the children, families, and communities to help us figure out how we actually do this work? How do we engage? What are the simple things that can happen? If you look at those 3 posters that you see there, all of those are available as part of the toolkit. If you go out to actions for the number 4, actions with an S, 4aces.com, you will find that toolkit, and you'll be able to download any of the materials that you see out there, and you can actually then modify them to a degree so that you can use them internally with the things that you want. But the thing that we understand is that until we have awareness across the state of New Jersey, and I know folks have said, well, we've been doing a lot of ACEs work for a long time. And yes, we have. And still, there is a massive number of people across the state of New Jersey. Yeah, I'm sorry. I read the chats as they're coming across. And thank you, Karen. Karen is saying that there is a real pandemic. And it's interesting, and I haven't verified these numbers, so don't shoot me if they're not totally right. But I've also asked DCF Research to help me verify. One of the things that we know about the pandemic is that in a 12-month period, we had 500,000 people die. When I talked with folks at the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice about this, one of the things that they looked at was population attributable risk. And when they looked at it, what they found was in a 12-month period, yes, there were 500,000 deaths from COVID, but there were over 650,000 deaths that were attributed to ACEs. So we have multiple pandemics going on. And so as we think about how we do this work, most of the things that folks have talked about up to this point have involved trauma at some level. And so my responsibility, my office's responsibility, not just to DCF, but to every state agency, working with all of the nonprofit communities and figuring out how we do this work and making sure that this doesn't just focus on Black and brown bodies, because there are a lot of red bodies and a lot of other colored bodies in this state that are being impacted. And so how do we make sure that we're embracing all of our diversity and responding to everyone who is in need? Next slide, please. Well, go ahead. There must be something there, so I'm not sure how that works. There's something above. Okay, there it is. Keep going. Just go ahead. There should be 4 things on that. One more. And so we have what we refer to as the Healing New Jersey Together project. It started out to be a technical assistance center. And when we brought the community into it, one of the things that they said was, we don't like the word trauma informed in it. We want it to be more healing centered. And they didn't like the fact that it was a technical assistance center. They said it was more than that. And so what we created was an online tool that anyone can pretty much access to get data, that you can, if you want to do a trauma-informed assessment, we've done reviews of all of the assessment tools out there, at least the ones that we can find. We've written them all up. You can go out and look, you can pick and choose. We have some recommendations. If you want to do training around adverse childhood experiences, we've listed as many as we can find in the state of New Jersey. And we give you the pros and cons of each of them. You can access all of this information and more. We've done training of over 150 people to do presentations on ACEs. And we're really specific when we talk about presentations on ACEs. We don't want you to hear a presentation about ACEs. We want to give you an ACEs presentation, and there is a difference. But we've got closer now to 170 presenters and 14 trainers who are able to train other presenters. We just completed a cohort of 30 that the projections say all 6,700 DCF staff will be trained by the end of fiscal year 2023, which starts in about 7 months. It starts in June of next year. We're looking at, we have, again, that assessment portal. And then we created a New Jersey specific, if you haven't heard of PACES or ACES connection. So it used to be Adverse Childhood Experiences Connection, ACES connection. They put a P on it because we know that there are positive experiences also. So it's positive and adverse childhood experiences. They are a national platform, but we've created a New Jersey specific page where you can find out anything happening around trauma in the state of New Jersey. You can also post your own events, blogs, whatever you need to on it. You can ask questions, and there are a ton of resources located there also. All of those things I talked about, from the plan to looking for presenters, those types of things, you can find all of that information on that New Jersey specific page. Please join us there. We would love to have you there. Next slide, please. Keep going. Should be 3. That's it. Thank you. So, and this is my last slide. And so for those of you who are old enough that you remember the show called The Coneheads with Dan Aykroyd, if you remember the cone of silence, and Brian Ross will know exactly what I'm talking about. So I am under a cone of silence. I can only tell you so much about the innovation microgrants and the process that we're utilizing. Suffice it to say that in October, and thank you, Commissioner Byer, for this, the Department of Children and Families and the Office of Resilience announced the availability of up to $3 million over 2 years to create 3 regional, 1 north, 1 central, 1 south, regional ACE collaboratives. We call them RACs, and no, it's not Rent-A-Center, but it could be. These folks will help us then reach deeper into community. The point of being micro is not about the size of the grant. Micro is about the size of the agencies that we're looking for. We're looking for agencies who traditionally, as far as micro grants. So you've got the RACs that are going to help us find those smaller agencies that traditionally don't get state level grants, or it might be an individual. You see there a list of the RFP and questions and answers and a link to that. And so I would suggest, I will tell you that the RAC process closes tomorrow. Sorry, it closes today on the 10th. And so that's as much as I can give you on that. If you've got technical questions that you need to have answered, you can see the link there, dcf.ask.rfp@dcf.nj.gov. Yeah, well, there you go. Someone is out there and watching me. Thank you, Steve. It wasn't Dan Aykroyd. I think he said it was Get Smart. But anyhow, someone know, and that's even older. And so I'm old enough to remember both of them, Steve. So thank you for that. And this is a part of the way that the Office of Resilience does business. We trust that the people out there, if we are saying something that is absolutely not true, we welcome your input, because our belief is that there is more intelligence out there than there is with us. The Office of Resilience is 5 staff and me. We have no, beyond those 5 staff, which the Department of Children and Families provides us, and our technical computers and phones, there is no state support for the Office of Resilience. We are not allowed to handle state money. The $3 million that we have is federal money that came back, that we are trying something totally different. In most cases, you cannot move state money to individuals. We're not. We're moving them to those 3 regional ACE collaboratives, and we're allowing them to run a process. They, in 90 days, and we'll be selecting those 3 soon, and you'll see an announcement come out, looking for ideas. We're not asking for a full proposal. We are looking for ideas. And those ideas can come to us in any form that you might need them to come, even a TikTok video. We will take those, we will look at them, we will begin to put them together. And again, the community is in this process with us. And so we have a full community advisory board. And then we have a group of other people who are just along with us that have said, we want to be a part of this. We welcome everyone into our processes. There is nothing that we don't have transparency on. If there's anything that we can do, please reach out. We are here to serve. I don't know if I've been 15 minutes or not, but I think I have. And I do believe that the next person I'm passing off to is Laura Jamet. And so Laura, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dave. Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Jamet. I'm the Deputy Director of Operations in the Division of Child Protection and Permanency here at DCF. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today about the implementation of solution-based casework within the Division of Child Protection and Permanency. At the last forum, you heard from Latavia Lee from SBC and one of our SBC champions from the Office of Professional Development. You heard about the case practice model and the enhancement of our case practice with the implementation of SBC and learned a little bit about how SBC is different than other approaches. Today, I'll be focusing on the training phase of implementation, which has spanned the last 5 months, and the benefits of SBC for families. Next slide, please. Before we dive in, I'm going to do a quick review of the 4 milestones of solution-based casework. Milestone 1 is building a consensus. This milestone is focused on sorting out together with the family what is not working. During this phase of caseworkers are having honest conversations that build towards family engagement and change. Milestone 2 is about making a case plan that we can agree on, including defining both family and individual level outcomes. Milestone 3 is about getting specific on what steps need to be taken and building out specific action plans. This involves providers to play a really critical role in supporting families and helping them achieve their goals. Milestone 4 is focused on working with families to problem solve challenges and noticing their successes in ensuring family safety and individual self-management. This milestone is about documenting and celebrating and making sure that others see the change that is happening within the family. Next slide, please. As you heard at the last forum, DCPMP went through a process to select champions from across the division. 54 champions underwent an intensive train the trainer with the developer of SBC, Dr. Dana Christensen, and his team. This was to prepare them to deliver SBC training themselves across the state of New Jersey. The training phase of implementation followed, and on June 28th, DCF launched the first of many cohorts of SBC training. About 250 different cohorts ran over the course of this phase. Training runs through November 19th, so we're just in the home stretch. Next slide, please. Full SBC training is broken down into 3 courses. There's initial training, supervisor training, and case consultation training. Each training session is approximately 2 hours. The initial training is a 5-week course. Supervisor training is also 5 weeks, and case consultation is 4 weeks. Each course includes live instruction, which was done virtually, as well as asynchronous learning through SBC's learning management system, Talent LMS. There's an assessment that followed the initial training and a qualifying examination for supervisors training, following the supervisor training that all participants need to take. Supervisor and case consultation training included homework and also live practice of the model. Initial training really laid the foundation and covered all the elements of SBC. And supervisor training focuses on how to supervise SBC and help participants deepen their understanding of the model. During the case consultation phase of training, participants learned how to use a provided agenda that walks each case through the major SBC practice model concepts, thus providing a good transfer of learning across the team. Case consultation is a critical tool that we'll be using throughout and beyond initial implementation. This is the way in which we'll be talking about cases moving forward. Caseworkers receive the initial SBC training. All supervisors, casework supervisors, local office managers, and other senior leaders in the Division of Child Protection and Permanency participated in the full supervisor series, including all 3 courses. Our other critical members of the local office team, such as our case practice specialists, case practice liaisons, our area quality coordinators, and concurrent planners also participated in the 3 courses, as their intricate understanding of SBC and their active involvement will be critical for a successful implementation. The Office of Quality staff here at DCF also participated, as they'll play a very key role during implementation and beyond. All in all, approximately 4,000 staff have been trained since June 28th or are completing training in the coming weeks. This includes all caseload carrying staff. The SBC management team and subcommittees are planning for additional communication and strategies and resources for providers across New Jersey regarding SBC. Next slide, please. Now we'll turn our attention for the next few minutes on how SBC will benefit families. SBC is an evidence-based and family-centered case practice model. SBC helps caseworkers to be partners with the families that they work with, as well as the providers of the services families need the most to be successful. SBC helps workers to get beyond the how of child abuse or neglect and to understand the why, and it customizes supports and solutions to the individual family's needs. Solution-based casework provides a common conceptual map to help everyone's focus on clear and agreed upon outcomes. In terms of how SBC will benefit families, there are 3 key elements I want to note here. First, SBC prioritizes creating a partnership with families. This begins at the very first interaction with families, and this is the work that's taking place in milestone 1 to establish consensus. SBC focuses on creating pragmatic solutions to everyday life challenges and to target those solutions to the prevention skills needed to create safety and reduce risk in those family situations. And lastly, SBC helps families recognize, document, and celebrate successes big and small, and helps others to see the change, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. In terms of our next steps, as we approach the end of the year, we're starting the next phase of implementation, case consultation. During the case consultation phase of implementation, supervisors will begin to facilitate weekly case consultation meetings with their teams where the SBC concepts are applied to a different family each session. As I mentioned earlier, the process of conducting a case consultation allows supervisors to walk cases through the major SBC practice model concepts, thus providing good transfer of learning across their whole teams for the caseworkers. During this phase of implementation, each caseworker, in conjunction with their supervisors, will focus their new skills on the new families as they work to master SBC. SBC champions will play a very critical role in this process, coaching, mentoring, and supporting staff during this important SBC phase of implementation. The certification phase is next. The 3rd phase begins as caseworkers are assigned their first new families to begin SBC. Supervisors and caseworkers will focus on getting the new family cases started out with the new model and then following each family through all 4 milestones. Cases coming to DCP&P after January 1st will experience SBC. During this phase, caseworkers will work to establish proficiency in each of the milestones in the SBC model. This phase will be ongoing, and learning the practice model skills will be a day-to-day activity and part of each supervision session. We very much look forward to entering these next phases of implementation, which will allow us to operationalize all that we have learned during the course of the training phase of implementation. I'd like to again thank you for your time and attention. If you have any specific questions about SBC and its implementation across New Jersey, please do not hesitate to contact our Ask SBC mailbox at dcf-cpp.asksbc@dcf.nj.gov. That's dcf-cpp.asksbc@dcf.nj.gov. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Now I have the task of summing up this forum. There was so much great information shared. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you, Commissioner Byer, for your leadership. As I think about everything we've heard in the last 2.5 hours, I just think we're at a moment in time of great potential. The plans that the department has talked about today, as well as the leadership of Commissioner Byer, certainly DCF is leading the way, linked with the focus on equity and also the response from the community. I've been reading the chat and the Q&A as the conversation has gone on, and there are people in the community programs, providers, I think are critical, also a force in carrying out this plan. To me, I think what struck me the most is that this is really an opportunity to create a true system of family support, which I think we've had in parts in New Jersey, but not as a system. I think that's exciting. It's amazing that this came out of the pandemic, and it is especially exciting if Congress passes the Build Back Better Act, because there'll be support to carry this forward. I think, so looking forward to how this all comes together, I guess I would urge a focus on what I would call the 4 C's: connection, collaboration, coordination, and communication. Connection, how are families going to connect to these services? Access continues to be an issue, and looking at it, I know that connection is in the department's strategic plan. It is part of your motto. It drives the decision-making, but thinking further about how families will connect to the exciting things that were discussed today. Collaboration, how are we working not only across departments, but with communities? Again, looking at the chat and the response that people had to the discussion, there's so much excitement and energy and knowledge out there. How are we connecting with the community? And even more important, how are we connecting with families, not just in the implementation, but the design? Coordination, it is very exciting. I think the last 4 years have seen a growth of many services that New Jersey has not seen before. We have to make sure that they're coordinated across systems. Families don't operate within systems. How can we make sure that they are coordinated to be the most effective and the most efficient? And I would also add communication, not just among all of us, but communication externally, so that the public gets engaged and involved in the excitement around this discussion as well. Let me just thank everyone who participated. So much information was shared. There were a number of questions in the chat about whether a recording will be produced of this, whether the slides will be made available. ACNJ will connect back with DCF and confirm that. But if so, we will send an email out to everyone and share that information. I am hoping that it will be provided. So much was shared today, a lot of food for thought. Let me close again by thanking Commissioner Byer. I also, ACNJ appreciates the partnership we've had with DCF and your willingness to bring this information out in the series of regional forums that you have hosted with ACNJ since you became commissioner almost 4 years ago. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Commissioner.
No, that's it, Seal. You're closing us out. I just wanted to come on and say thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And again, Seal, thank you for the kind words and your partnership.
Again, this is an opportunity. If you have further questions, here are two emails that you can send DCF to ACNJ, and we will follow through with questions, information as well. Okay. Thank you, everyone.